Have you ever finished a 5-star book and instead of feeling happy, you feel the doubt creep in that nothing ever will compare to that book? It's so unique, spoke to you so specifically. How could anything else ever compare? If only I could find a book that was just like this one. Well, I felt that quite a few times over the past months, so in this video, I want to read books that are recommended off of my 5-star reads. It seems like a pretty surefire way to find a good book, so here's to hoping. Let's find out. One of my first 5-star books of 2024 was The Prisoner's Throne by Holly Black, which is after the Folk of the Air trilogy, which is one of my favorite series of all time. The series after that one follows the little brother from the first trilogy into the Stolen Heir duology, and this one was the second book of that duology. And I am obsessed with her writing style. I'm obsessed with how whimsical the world is, and also how the crumbs of romance you get is so angsty. I love when love is described as hate. To clarify, I only mean that because they actually do like each other and they're just in denial, not because they actually hate each other. Like, they're obsessed with each other. And she is like the queen of doing that, and I have never been able to find a single book that's related to these books. I've tried other ones. The first book that I read this year was Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. People had told me, there's fairies, it's whimsical, there's an enemies to lovers romance plot. It's similar to these books, and it's just not. Like, I understand why they're compared to be similar, but it's just not. So let's go to the Goodreads account. When you're on a book on Goodreads, you can scroll all the way to the bottom, and it will say, readers also enjoy. And it's books that are pretty much in the same genre. So for The Prisoner's Throne, readers also enjoyed Powerless and Reckless by Lauren Roberts. I did read Powerless, and Reckless is upstairs on my nightstand because I do want to read that soon. Love this series. Bride by Ali Hazelwood. This was also like a 4.5 5-star book for me this year, so that also makes sense. A Curse for True Love. This book is from the Once Upon a Broken Heart series, and I have way too many editions of this book. There's also one right there. This is where that series lives on my bookshelf, and I'm absolutely obsessed with the series. This one in particular is the last book in the trilogy, and it is my least favorite, but these first two books are perfect. I love them. So whimsical, so fun, best romance plot. I understand why it's similar to the Cruel Prince trilogy. That's a pretty good comparison. Even though it's not like the worlds are directly similar, it's just kind of the same feeling you get while reading it, where it's like the stakes are high enough for me to care, because that's the thing about cozy fantasy, is it's very low stakes, and I find myself being bored and not invested. So stakes are still extremely high, but there's something so whimsical about the world that you're in. It just feels magical, and then the romance is very similar with like describing love as hate. Okay, so I've read a lot of the books in this readers also enjoyed section. Let's see what the next ones are. Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. That is on my TBR shelf. This comes after Divine Rivals. It's a historical fiction, enemies to lovers romance plot as well. And I also have the special edition of this book, which is one of my favorite books on my entire shelf. It's so pretty. Look how cool that is. It's so sick. So yeah, this is definitely on my TBR. I want to read this, but let's keep looking. A Tempest of Tea. I don't know that much about this book, and I feel like my interest is not that piqued when looking at it. The second book to Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies is recommended. A Fate Inked in Blood. I see this one at Barnes & Noble every time I go, but I've never heard anyone talk about it. Heartless Hunter. This one I want to read so bad because I've seen hype about it for so long, and then I've seen the TikTok hype go to YouTube hype, and everyone's still liking it, and I want to read it really bad. I think it seems like a fast-paced enemies to lovers fantasy plot, which is just exactly what I love. The next 3 books on this list I have read: The Reappearance of Rachel Price, Not in Love by Ali Hazelwood, and House of Flame and Shadow by Sarah J Maas. So I think we're definitely in the correct vein of books that I should read, because almost all of the things other readers enjoyed were read by me already or on my bookshelf. So it seems accurate, but I think I'm going to go with Heartless Hunter because I'm the most excited to read that one, which means I'll probably enjoy it the best. So let's see if it's a good recommendation based off of one of my 5-star reads.
It's a strange kind of phase when you let go, let your life flow like a river. Break away from material ego. You never know what's around the corner for you.
I've been reading Heartless Hunter, and I'm officially 50% in. As I was reading it, the first chapters flew by, and it really gave me the vibe of young adult, so I went to go look it up, and it is a young adult book. And it really is just like a very fun, fast, easy fantasy romance, cat and mouse, enemies to lovers. I think it's gonna be a romance, I'm pretty sure. But it's like actual enemies because it's set in a world where being a witch is outlawed and you will get killed if they find out that you are one. So we're following Rune, who is a witch but pretends not to be, and then Gideon, who is an actual witch killer, and he is hunting her even though he doesn't know fully that he's hunting her. But it's set in like a Victorian era, so they're going to a lot of balls. They're talking about fashion. She's disguising herself as a socialite, and I love settings like that so much, but I don't like reading books that are set in that setting with the like old English vibe to it, and this just has like normal speech, but it just happens to be set in that time, so it's kind of perfect right now.
Beefs and struggles, but we keep on trying to hide it. Working so hard to keep it together. Maybe it's time that we let go. We're moving on, one step at a time, do something better.
Whoa, a lot's happening. I'm about to finish it.
Moving on, one step at a time.
I just finished it. The last 30 pages are crazy and so fast paced. That was a lot of fun. I did honestly read this kind of slowly because I took a break over the weekend, and I feel like it would have been so much better if I had just binge read it. But the next book comes out next year, I think, and I'm very excited to read that. This was a great book. Oh, my Bible just flew from the sky. Oh! So here was the 5-star book that started this journey and the related books to it that I've already read, and then the recommendation that came from it in a similar genre to these books. I've officially completed it, and I give it 4 stars, I think. Well, it could be a 4.25 because I really enjoyed it, but some of the parts were a little bit too YA in my opinion, I think, because the dialogue would be pretty like stereotypical lines in certain scenes where it's like, it almost felt like I was reading a script of like, okay, in this genre, in this scenario, what would a book say? It just was like exactly what you would think. So that wasn't like the most tantalizing experience for my brain. Tantalizing? I don't know if that's the right word. And honestly, this is one of those YA books where I'm like, oh wow, I didn't know that they could do that much in a YA book. I can't remember necessarily how much is on the page, but it's like definitely kind of part of the plot for the two characters to get together in that kind of way. But overall, I feel like the entire plot was really cool. It kind of feels like it's not going to have that big of a plot until the last 50 pages where you're like, oh yeah, there's a really cool plot going on here. I'm like kind of tired as I give this review, and I feel like it's showing. I also like that she didn't hold back on the story at the end there. It was good. I'm trying not to give spoilers. I definitely want to read the next book. It's just a very fun and fast-paced book if you want to read a fantasy romance. I highly recommend this one, and it makes sense why it would be related to this category of books. It's not my favorite out of the ones that I've read. It definitely feels a little bit more cookie cutter, but sometimes that's just good when you want to eat something that you know you'll like. First book done. The next 5-star read, which I think is one of my favorite books of the entire year so far, The Ministry of Time by Kayleigh Bradley. I found this book through Book of the Month. It was one of their picks, so I chose it. I'd never heard anything about it because this is her debut novel, but she's won 2 awards for her short stories. I have another copy that she sent to me signed, and it has like the really cool 3D glossy look. I think it's one of my favorite covers of the year as well, but I loaned it out because I want everyone who I know to read it. This book has some of my favorite quotes of all time in it. I actually read it in real time in this vlog, but I don't think I've talked about it on this channel very much. The plot is basically that the British government has figured out time travel, and they're starting this program where they're going to save people who were about to die and then take them out of their time and plop them in the 21st century. And we're following a main character whose name you never really get, and she gets put in charge of this 1800s naval officer. His name is Graham Gore, which is actually a person who existed in the 1800s as a naval officer. But if you look up the reviews of this book, I feel like they're so mixed, and it makes sense because this book is not committing to any one genre. It's a science fiction, but not all the way. It's a literary fiction, but not all the way. It's a romance, but not all the way. But all of those things combined has made it my favorite book of all time, and also because I have never seen the English language manipulated in the way that she writes her sentences or uses words or creates metaphors, and that is what I eat up about books, is how someone can manipulate words in a way that you've never seen before. It like tickles my brain in a way that I cannot explain. So let me read you one of my favorite quotes. I'm obsessed with this book. It's like 6 stars. Honestly, as I'm writing a book and if I feel self-doubt about publishing it, sometimes I'll just go look at the reviews of this book and be like, okay, if people cannot like this book and it just be the most amazing thing in my brain that I've ever read, it gives me a little bit of confidence, you know? Like, not everyone has the same taste and not everyone loves the same things as I do, but it's okay because I love this book so deeply. I'm just gonna rattle off a few quotes real quick. He lives in me like trauma does. If you ever fall in love, you'll be a person who was in love for the rest of your life. Yeah. If you remember me saying about this book that she writes love as hate, I feel like it's kind of the same thing in this book where she's relating love to things that are like not happy at all, but but for some reason I eat that up. I don't really know what that says about me. I had always thought of joy as a shouting, flamboyant thing that tossed breath into the sky like a ball. Instead, it robbed me of my speech and my air. I was pinned in place by joy and I didn't know what to do. I was filled with happiness so enormous and terrifying it was as if I had committed a crime to get it. No one had given me permission to feel this way, and I thought I might not be allowed it. He combed his fingers through my hair and I was frightened with happiness, harrowed by it. There was no way that anyone could feel this much without also knowing they were going to lose it. Like, being frightened with happiness, the dichotomy of those two things, like they shouldn't go together, and that just, it does it for me. Abrupt scene change because my SD card ran out of storage. But I was just about to get to the best quote. Remember that being in love is a form of blunt force trauma. I was concussed with love for him. I bent my head to the cudgel. I bent my head to the cudgel was a line that played in my head over and over and over again months after reading the book. 6 stars, I'm obsessed. But the trouble with being obsessed with a book like this, which is so unique in its genre and topic, it's hard to find books that are similar to it, and I will admit, I probably like this book more than the average person because I could relate so strongly to some of the things inside of it. Even the author herself is Cambodian, but a lot of people don't know that about her until they find out, which I'm half white, half Vietnamese. I'm not to say what I look like to other people because I can't see myself from an outside perspective, but even her talking about having an immigrant mom was so relatable and just thrown in there a lot, and I've just never really read something like that in a book. But it's mostly for the writing that I enjoy the story so much, so I'm very curious to see what Goodreads would think is similar to this book, and hopefully they're correct so that I can read it and find more books like this one. So let's give it a go. It says readers also enjoyed, and then all of these books. Let's just see how many I've read. Out of the 18 books that are similar, I have read 6 of them, and they're basically all the ones on the list that are romance heavy. The rest on the list seem to be more on the literary fiction side of things, but the genres are science fiction, fiction, romance, time travel, fantasy, historical fiction, adult, speculative fiction, and historical, which is interesting. I guess it is kind of historical. I went to the store and bought 3 of the books on this list that I have not read. The first one being Margot's Got Money Troubles by Rufi Thorpe. These were all in the new hardback section of the bookstore, so they're all beautiful covers and just very satisfying. This one is pretty short, and most of the reviews for this book are that it's just very funny. Oh, the review on the front says, by a writer so singular that it's hard to compare her to anyone else, which is exactly how I feel about Kaylee Bradley, so that's intriguing. The Husbands by Holly Gramazio. This one is interesting because of the cover again, but also because Gabrielle Zevin has a review on the front, and she wrote Tomorrow, 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 and The Storied Life of AJ Fikry, which are all on my 5-star book stack shelf. And she's also such a unique author that I never know who to compare her to, so her having a review on this book is very intriguing, and I know it has magical realism elements to it. And then the last one I got was The Lost Story by Meg Schaefer because I read The Wishing Game by this author this year and I really enjoyed it. It's also kind of magical realism, literary fiction, fantasy vibes, and I really like just the mixing of genres a lot. So these 3 are all similar, so I'm gonna choose one and start reading. Dun, 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 dun. I chose The Husbands. The font that they used for these reviews is satisfying my brain every time I look at it, and the colors. This is a very nice cover. Okay, premise of this book is one of the more interesting ones I've ever heard before. Basically, we've got a science fiction magical realism vibe where one night Lauren comes home from a drunk night out. She's a single woman, but she has a husband in her apartment. She thinks he's an intruder, of course, but she looks at her phone and there's a photo of them married. She goes through her camera roll. There's years of photos of them together. She basically discovers that if she sends up this man to the attic, there will be a weird light and buzz, and then a new man will come down, and she can experience all different types of husbands, which is so interesting. I feel like there's so many places you could go with that premise. I'm about to hit page 200, and when I got to 160 pages, it was starting to feel like, okay, this is really silly, haha time, but it's lacking a goal. It's lacking a direction. It just feels like reading words to read them until someone comes down, and now it's picked up a little bit. Again, I don't want to say what it is. I will read you one of the highlighted things that I highlighted so that you can see an example sometimes of what the writing is like. Some of the husbands make noises. They say words over and over. One puts his hand on her forehead as she lies in bed, spreads his fingers out and presses. A compression, like all her unruly thoughts are being calmed. She misses it when he leaves. Tries to explain to the next husband, but he can't get it right. One husband does 40 push-ups every morning, and when she asks him how his day went, he shrugs and says, at least I did 40 push-ups. That one got me. One of them balances on one leg while he brushes his teeth. She never figures out why. One saves his toenail clippings in a small jar and jokes. She thinks it's a joke, but she never finds out for sure that he's going to use them to make gelatin when he has enough. So yeah, she's honestly going through the husbands very quickly. I thought it might have been a thing where like you experience 3 different husbands throughout the whole book, but no, we're at like probably 200 husbands at this point, and she's still going. We're only on page 200, so I'm very curious to see how she wraps up the story, how she makes me more attached to the characters, because obviously we're very detached to everyone. We're just in Lauren Lauren's, well, we're not really. We're in third person POV and we're only really following Lauren, but I'm not even that attached to her. There has been one man who she was sad to see leave and it was on accident that he left. So I feel like she could use that to make me really care about the story, but if she doesn't, I'm just very curious to see where this goes. And Spock is chewing his bone now, so that's my cue to keep reading. Finished The Husbands. I have painted my nails since then. My review of this very unique book is number one. Her writing style was very unique in the way that she writes how people think, and she also writes dialogue like real people talk, so it was almost so realistic that it freaked me out a little bit. Like, she'll put the ums in. It's just very stream of conscious, and obviously I think the concept is what has made this book so popular. It's her debut novel, and the concept feels like a prompt you would be given as a writing activity that's like, if you could exchange husbands every time they went in an attic, who could come out of it and how many lives could you have? And it's like this metaphor about all of the lives that you could live. None of them were like exceptionally better. Some were worse, but overall, you do just have to choose the life you want to live, and they're all gonna have pros and cons. And I feel like you could have taken that prompt and written it as just like this whimsical little, you know, go through over 200 husbands, and it's very silly. It's very unserious. Like, you're never gonna get an explanation for why this is happening. Or you could have taken this down a very emotional route, and I feel like she could have chosen one emotional aspect, maybe of the main character, Lauren, who we're following, for her to find whatever was missing in her life or something that she really wanted in a partner. But you don't really get that, and I feel like Lauren, the main character, didn't even really have a character progression at the end of the story. On the very last page, maybe she had a little bit of a different perspective, but overall, it doesn't really feel like she grows very much. And you also never get emotionally attached to anyone in the story, except for almost this one person who I thought she was gonna make the crux of the story, but then we just like never really see him again in any meaningful way. So the whole book felt like a writing prompt for the sake of writing to a silly little prompt. And it was fun and repetitive, and it's like a time loop. And because of that, it does feel kind of comforting. But then at the same time, it just felt like the stakes were not very high and she wasn't learning anything from this experience. It also gets more outlandish as the book goes on, which in the moments where it was supposed to be tense, it definitely felt tense. So that was written very well. But yeah, the book just didn't take an emotional angle at all. And I feel like this could have been such a romantic book if she took the perspective of like finding one of the people who is so unlike all the rest, and he somehow like disappears back into the attic again, and she spends the rest of the book trying to find that man again, because in comparison no one else lived up to him. That could have been so cute. I also love like a good time travel romance, and I feel like that's kind of the angle, but I feel like it also is not written in scenes. Like, I feel like we don't really get any landscape around us. It's just like every 2 or 5 sentences is a new thing happening.
Honey, I gotta go to work.
A real life interruption.
I love you.
Love you. That's the husband I got from the attic. But yeah, it was whimsical and I wanted more from the concept, but it was still a good read. I'd probably give it 3.5 stars because it was very fun to read about all the different husbands. I do understand why it was recommended off of the Ministry of Time, because the concepts of both books are very amazing and they don't make any actual sense in the real world. But in execution, this one is so emotional, and I feel like takes a very big emotional take on grief, even with a concept that is so outlandish, and that's why I loved it so much. But I still had a lot of fun reading it, and I definitely want to read more literary fiction. But now I'm thinking the next 5-star book that I want to find something similar to is an author that I had never heard of before reading this book, because it is her debut novel, but it took me by surprise so much, and I gave it 5 stars, which is so unexpected for having never heard anyone talk about it, and that is Love Interest by Claire Gilmore. I ended up relating to a lot of the things in this book. One of the things is that the 2 characters get to know each other through a YouTube collab, which hits a little too close to home, but they work in finance, so I definitely can't relate to that. I read this during a 24-hour readathon, and now I'm looking through my underlines, and sometimes I feel like books will just randomly hit for you because you're so in the mood to read a book that, like, a line that would never normally stand out to me just stood out so much. Like, I underlined, "The night air is as crisp as a freshly minted dollar." And I wrote, "A rare, accurate metaphor." It's like, that feels so dramatic for that line, but in that moment, I was eating this book up. Not to say that it's bad, but I just am curious why I was so obsessed. Edward Cullen Coded. Let's see what I thought was that. Alex traces the rim of his glass with his middle finger and shakes his head in exasperation, but he's smiling down at the bar top. Okay, that is Edward Cullen Coded, like him smiling in exasperation while looking down, that is go watch Twilight. A lot of the things also reminded me of Gus from Beach Read, which is one of my 5-star books. So I'm very curious to see what similar books to this would be because I'd never read this author, so maybe I will find a new author again. Out of the 18 recommended books, I've read 10 out of the 18 recommended. Some of the recommended ones I've never seen before, like Friends Don't Fall in Love, The Rom-Con, The Predictable Heartbreaks of Imogen Finch, and I have seen the other ones before, but this is literally perfect because one of the recommended books is The X-Vows by Jessica Joyce. Oh, I actually have read this author before. I read You with a View, which I think I bought at the exact same time that I bought this one in the same store. Anyways, my friend Sarah texted me directly recommending me this book, The X-Vows, saying that I would like it, and she hasn't texted me like a specific book rec in so long that I was like, oh wow, that's huge, I should probably read it then. So this is perfect. It's recommended off of this one. We're gonna read a fun little rom-com, so let's start that one. I have my emotional support, Stanley, resting on me. I'm 52% through The X-Vows. I started this book yesterday and I really wished I would have captured my reaction when I first started it, because when I first started it after the prologue, I was like, I am so excited for this book. I think it's gonna be so good. The writing is so good. I had a good feeling about it, but now I'm 56% through it and I don't like it as much, which is, I still have a lot to go, so I hope that changes. Okay, I finished The X-Vows. It's been a few days because I haven't really wanted to record this review because I personally feel bad that I feel like I just didn't give the book a fair shot. It was great in the prologue, and then after 50%, I stopped caring about it, which is the same thing that happened when I read her other book, You with a View. I thought the beginning was so good and I was so invested, and then I get to the 50%. I feel like she always puts her spice scenes at the 50%. I don't know if that was what the switch was. I feel like it kind of came before that even happened, but then I just stopped caring, and I don't know why. I feel like her writing is good. I feel like everything about the trope in The X-Vows with the childhood friends to lovers, the found family friend group, a lot of her internal struggles with like wanting to be valuable to her friends, feeling kind of lost in the world and finding her place with her friends was all such a great backstory that I feel like I could have really connected to, and I just don't know why I didn't, and I feel like it probably was just my mood while reading the book more so than the actual book itself. There's nothing I can think of that the book actually did where I was like checked out for any reason. So don't take it as a critique. It just was my experience reading the book. But yeah, it makes sense being recommended off of this book. It feels like the same thing with this book. If I had read this one on a different week, maybe I just wouldn't have liked it that much and gave it 3 stars, but I was so in the mood to read it and I was soaking up every single sentence, so I gave it 5 stars. And sometimes it just happens like that. So overall, I would say it's a pretty good way to figure out what book to read next. I look back on reading The Husbands with fond memories, so if you like the concept, I actually do recommend it. Just expect a fun whimsical time, but it's kind of nice if you just want to take your mind off of things and have it be kind of more cozy and less serious, then I would recommend this one. And then finally reading Heartless Hunter, recommended off of The Prisoner's Throne, was also a great experience, and I can't wait to continue with this series as well. I'm kind of excited for fall to read more fantasy. But regardless, shout out to my 5-star books. If you haven't read any of these, I highly recommend. And I will see you guys on Instagram or my vlog channel or somewhere else on the internet. Bye!